So good evening, officially, everyone, to a Bible study here, Wednesday evening, December 3rd. We are in the midst of, I'm calling this part two, actually, of a short series of Bible studies going over the book of Nahum. And I debated whether trying to finish tonight, but then I decided I don't think I could do justice to it. So we're only going to cover chapter 2, but that gives me a little extra time, I hope, to do a little more background. So let's just recap what we studied last time in chapter 1. The author is Nahum, about which we know almost nothing. We know that he was an Elkoshite, but we don't know where Elkosh was. And if God had wanted us to know, he would have told us. So I didn't spend a lot of time trying to dig any deeper. His name means comforter or consolation. Now that's interesting. As we go through this, obviously he was a comforter and one who could console Judah, but certainly not for Nineveh, and there are reasons for that. You know, Nineveh had temporarily repented at the preaching of Jonah, and according to our own Beyond Today Bible commentary, that was about 150 years earlier, prior to the actual fall of Nineveh. So, despite repentance, which was an amazing thing, just an amazing thing in the Bible to read of, and I think you know the story, the king even issued an order that everyone would fast there in the city, even animals would fast, and God recognized that and did not punish them at the time. We know that Nahum wrote this sometime between, and if dates are important to you, he wrote this sometime between 663 and 612 BC. The reason for 663, and if you note Nahum chapter 3 and verse 8, and we won't cover that tonight, but there's a mention of Ammon, which is actually Thebes in Egypt. And most Bibles will have that in the margin. We know from history that's when Thebes fell. We know from history that in 612 BC, counting down as you do in BC, that's when Nineveh fell. So sometime within that 51 year period is when Nahum wrote, and then how long thereafter his prophecy was fulfilled, we don't exactly know. But it gives you an idea of the time frame. Now, there's more here than meets the eye. He's addressing Nineveh, but Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time. And hence, it's actually the end not only of that city, that great capital, but it is the end of the Assyrian Empire. Now, earlier, God had actually delivered the northern tribes of Israel, that is his people, into the hands of the Assyrians. And that was because of their repeated sinful conduct. And I'm going to cover just a little bit of that tonight in the way of background. But now, if you remember what we studied in chapter 1, God is, the New King James says, furious with Nineveh, and by extension with Assyria, because they had become so evil themselves. Remember, they not only conquered, but they were overcome with greed. They plundered. But worse than that, they were absolutely brutal. Anyone who resisted them did so at their own peril. And they didn't always kill. They mutilated. They cut off noses. They cut off ears. They cut off hands. Cut the tongues out of people, and I'll just stop there. They did even worse things. But that's what they were known for. And if you do just a casual research on who the Assyrians were, you're going to find those things. Now, at the same time, in chapter 1, we found Nahum giving comfort to Judah. They were going to be able to resume keeping the feasts of God, and the yoke of their oppressors would be removed, if you remember some of those phrases. And of course that happened in Hezekiah's time. The Assyrians under Sennacherib actually went down and threatened Judah, and threatened to come into the very capital down there in Jerusalem. But I think you know what happened. Hezekiah, unlike the northern tribes, and their king, was very repentant, and he took it before God. You remember, laid out, I won't turn there, but he laid out that letter from the messenger from the Assyrians, threatening Jerusalem and with all kinds of harm, and God delivered them mightily. Snuffed out the lives of 185,000 Assyrian troops in one night. And you might say Sennacherib went home with his tail between his legs, just to use that cliche. So, a very important lesson in all of this, and I actually wrote about this in my midweek message as well, from a little bigger perspective, but remember what we talked about, particularly as we closed out last time. So often there is duality in prophecy, and there certainly is here. Now, Judah, unfortunately, also went into captivity later for not holding fast and for not obeying God, and so there's some later fulfillments yet to come. Again, the yoke being broken and so forth, and resuming the keeping of the feasts, that's actually millennial. You read about that in Zechariah, where the whole world is going to go up and keep the feast, but where are they going to go? Well, to Jerusalem, where Judah was headquartered. So again, there's just always duality, but a lot of things to happen in between. Now, this time I'd like to give a little more background because I think I have time. I want to go back to Genesis chapter 10. By the way, as far as Assyria, the first mention of Assyria is all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, but that's just geographic. The Garden of Eden was actually in that area, actually where Nineveh was. But I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 10. I found this interesting because here we have quite a brief, but I'll put it this way, a condensed account of civilization being reestablished or carried on after the flood. And I won't read too much of this chapter, but if you would begin with me in, let's see, verse 8. Genesis 10, verse 8. Cush, by the way, was a grandson of Noah through Noah's son Ham. So we got a grandson of Noah here named Cush, and he has a son. He begot Nimrod. I think most of us know about Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord, and the beginning of his kingdom. And there's some problems here, but I don't have time to comment about that. He wanted to establish a name for himself. So the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, along with some other cities here. So the original founder or builder of Nineveh was Nimrod. So it's a very old city. By the way, I do want to comment about this, although it doesn't have a lot of bearing here on the study of Nahum, but the translation in the King James, or the New King James, which I virtually always read from, is not as accurate as it could or should be. I want to read from the International Standard Version, which is actually accurate. Nimrod's name, by the way, actually means rebellion. Rebellion. Not a flattering name. But here's the rendering of Genesis 10 and verse 9 out of the International Standard Version. He became a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. I want you to remember that. It's the beginning of rebellion after the flood. He became a fearless hunter in defiance of the Lord. And this is supported by one of our own online publications. It's online. It's called Know Your Sword. I don't know how many of you go there. That's really essentially targeting young adults. But I sometimes go there and I find some good information there. Now, the Assyrian Empire was the most powerful in the world before the Babylonian Empire arose. It reached the zenith of its power in the 9th down to the 7th centuries BC. And you can find that in several sources. Now, there's something interesting that the Assyrians were designated by God to punish Israel. Now, to prove that to you, let's go to Isaiah 10. This is interesting background. Isaiah 10, please. And if you don't remember this, then we'll just read it together. But this tells you that there was a time when God used the Assyrians to fulfill his purpose. And in Isaiah 10, if you were there, I want to read verses 5 and 6. It's a lengthy prophecy here, but I'll only read verses 5 and 6. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation. I will send him, that is Assyria, verse 6, I will send him against an ungodly nation and against the people of my wrath. I will give him charge to seize the spoil, to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. You know, that's kind of sobering, but why would God do that to some of his own people? Well, let's go back to 2 Kings. Here's an answer, 2 Kings. If you would go back to 2 Kings chapter 15, and I'm just going to read some snippets here. The kings, by and large, in the northern tribes of Israel, were not godly men. Over and over, you will read so-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord. Well, if you're in 2 Kings now, chapter 15, I want you to begin reading with me in verse 17. Verse 17, in the 39th year of Azariah, king of Judah, Menahem, the son of Gadai, became king over Israel. So remember, the tribes are separated now. Judah is the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is called Israel. So a new king, Menahem, is now over Israel. It says he reigned 10 years in Samaria. That was their capital. Verse 18, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who had made Israel sin. I think if you're a student of the Bible, you know what Jeroboam did right at the beginning of the separation there in Israel between the southern kingdom, which was known as Judah, and the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes of Israel. Jeroboam immediately led them into idolatry and to sin, and it just perpetuated. Here we are years, centuries later, and it's still going on. Now, in verse 19, please, Pul, it says, by the way, that's another name for Tiglath-Pileser. You'll find that name in history, but they're the same man. Who was he? Well, verse 19, king of Assyria came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom under his control. Now, that's probably, again, not the easiest translation to understand. What he's really doing is paying tribute, bribe money in a sense, so that Assyria just doesn't come right in and conquer and take them over. Then in verse 20, Nahum exacted the money from Israel, from all the very wealthy, from each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. And Assyria was known for this. They would place these nations under tribute, and it was steep. And so, again, it worked, though. At this time, it says the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. At least right at the time, he didn't stay there. As long as they paid their tribute, they were reasonably safe. So, what happens here? Assyria puts Israel and its king in a vassal state, having to maintain some level of autonomy by paying this bribe money or this tribute. In verse 29, same chapter, verse 29 of chapter 15, 2 Kings, in the days of Pekah. Now this is another king. This is later. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, Tiglath-Pileser, here's again, this is Paul, same king, came and took Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Janoah, Kedesh, Hazor, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried them captive to Assyria. And then it goes on. So now, it goes beyond just paying tribute and being a vassal state. Now they're carried into captivity. 2 Kings 17. Turn ahead a couple of chapters, please. 2 Kings chapter 17. I want to read with you beginning in verse 16. I'm breaking in here, chapter 17, verse 16. Let's see if this is the best. Let's glance beginning at verse 15. Verse 15, they rejected his statutes, meaning God's statutes, and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies. They followed idols, if you skim with me. They became idolaters, and they went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. It gets worse. Verse 17, and they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire. Now that's a King James phraseology for child sacrifice. But continue. Practiced witchcraft and soothsaying, and they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his sight. And he had chosen the Assyrians to do that. And then it ends, that verse 18, there was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. Now we do know Benjamin was aligned down there with Judah and many of the Levites. Although if you glance ahead, then Judah later got themselves in trouble as well. If you want to read sort of a summary statement, now this goes clear out. Turn to the very end of 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 36. This is essentially the end of the history of all of Israel, including Judah. It's the very last chapter of 2 Chronicles. I just want to read this. Now, this goes later in time, but why did God punish his people? Well, if you're in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, would you begin reading with me in verse 15? And the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers. Nahum was one and many other prophets, but they rose up early and sending them because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. God has compassion, but he can only tolerate so much. Verse 16, but they mock the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. There was no longer any remedy, no way of getting them to repent, short of sending them into captivity. So now let's go back to Nahum's time. By this time, Assyria had become one of the most ruthless, cruel, and brutal empires in history, not just in the time, but in all history. They went beyond what God intended. God didn't intend punishment. Taking tribute and so forth, that is one thing, but they pillaged, they destroyed, they tortured, they killed in the most savage ways. Now their judgment has come. So now I want to go back to the book of Nahum. Nahum chapter 2. Now we're going to talk about the destruction of Nineveh. Where we ended last time, maybe it'll transition a little better if we look at the last verse of chapter 1. Nahum 1, verse 15, behold, on the mountains the feet of him who brings good tidings, who proclaims peace. O Judah, this is where Nahum, is true to his name. He's a comforter. He's offering consolation to Judah. O Judah, keep your appointed feasts. Perform your vows. For the wicked one shall no more pass through you. He is utterly cut off. Now that was a reference to Nineveh at the time and to the Assyrians. But we do know later, because of the same sins and worse that Israel had committed, Judah fell into the same trap. And they were carried off by the Babylonians. But this is dual again, because there's going to come a time when the appointed feasts will be kept universally, and the wicked will no longer pass through the land and will be utterly cut off. Now, chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. This is a call to arms. He who scatters has come up before your face. Man the fort, watch the road, strengthen your flanks, fortify your power mightily. Now, in studying this, I have been somewhat frustrated with King James translation at times. I'd like to read that from the New Living Translation. Same verse. Your enemy is coming to crush you. Man the ramparts. Watch the roads. Prepare your defenses. Call out your forces. Now, in a sense, God is, through Nahum, he's taunting Nineveh, and by extension the Assyrian Empire, because they think they are so strong and so invincible. And indeed, they had been. But now they're dealing with God and not human foes. Verse 2. For the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches. So this is comfort again to Israel, to Jacob. Again, I'd like to read part of that from another translation, in this case, the New English Translation. For the Lord will restore the majesty of Jacob, as well as the majesty of Israel, though their enemies have plundered them and have destroyed their fields. And that's another thing that the Assyrians were guilty of. They would go in and absolutely destroy. You know, I was reading this and pondering this. How many of you, you can't interact with me right now verbally, but you can raise your hand. How many of you read about the infamous Sherman's March to the Sea? That's in American history. Aha, some hands go up. I'm happy. Some of you know your American history. I'm pulling this full name out of my tiny little memory bank, but I think it was William Tecumseh Sherman. He was a feared general on the Union side in the Civil War, and his march to the sea began in Atlanta, Georgia, over to the coast at Savannah, and then up the coast through the Carolinas. And if you care to read much about that, now, he wasn't as brutal as the Assyrians. He wasn't cutting off noses and so forth and hands. But it was a scorched earth policy. Some of you have heard that term. They pillaged, they burned, they emptied the land, so to speak. And in a sense, it broke the back of the Confederacy, because down in that region, it was rich agriculturally, and they were supplying so much of the key provisions for the Confederate Army. Well, that's what Assyria was doing, and worse. They were emptiers. They would empty out the land and destroy the fields. But again, the Lord's going to restore, and keep thinking duality here. Let's keep moving, though. Verse 3. The shields of his mighty men are made red. The valiant men are in scarlet. The chariots come with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the spears are brandished. Kind of interesting. It shifts back to those who would come against Nineveh. Very interesting background to some of this. I had the opportunity to study a number of commentaries about most of these verses. Brilliant scarlet, by the way, was the color of choice for the coats or the cloaks of both the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, I meant the Medes and the Babylonians. And by the way, they are the ones, along with Scythians, who came up and destroyed Nineveh. Nahum doesn't say who's going to do it, but you can find that in Bible history, or a secular history for that matter. The Babylonians, and they became the next dominant empire in the world in that time. And of course, they're the ones who later took Judah into captivity. But all of this happened just exactly as Nahum said it would. And it's interesting to read things that back this up. They were known for these brilliant colors. But there's something else about the color of these shields. The shields of his mighty men are made red. From the Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary, the ancients dyed their bull's hide shields red, partly to strike terror into the enemy, but also to conceal the blood from the wounds which these soldiers might receive. And then the enemy would perceive that and realize they're bleeding, and it would give them confidence. But the shields are already red. The cloaks are already scarlet. So blood from any distance at all didn't show up all that well. And another thing is they were just, those red shields struck fear into a lot of people. It was their turn to become dominant. A little more about these chariots. They come with flaming torches in the day of his preparation. Verse 4, I'll read that and then make some more comment. The chariots rage in the streets. They jostle one another in the broad roads. They seem like torches. They run like lightning. Now, the chariots rage, and the fact they seem like torches, there are several comments in reference to the fact that the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians had developed chariots that were fitted with steel blades or iron. I don't know that they had steel then as we know it, but iron blades sharpened, fastened to the sides and the wheels of chariots. So as they're going, turning, moving, this was lethal to any foot soldier or horses that came near them. And in their day, this was a fearsome military machine. Also the flashing, they would gleam in the light. So I find that very interesting. But when you think about duality again, the lightning, you get the impression they're darting around. They're very fast. Well, in Nahum's day, they were chariots drawn by horses. But when you think of duality, what do we have today? You know, military hardware, military machines, tanks. I always think of tanks as rather cumbersome, but one of the commentaries, and even our own Beyond Today Bible commentary, alludes to modern warfare and tanks and what they can do. They can turn on a dime, so to speak, but also lightning. You know, you think about modern warfare. Modern warfare can produce incredible flashes and brightness. You think about the detonation of atomic and nuclear weapons, right? Blinding flashes. And then the destruction afterwards, the fires that start. Think about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, for example, where atomic weapons were used, but even bombs can do that. You know, soldiers talk about the flash, and then the percussion, the explosion, and then often fire and the damage that comes afterwards. Verse 5, he remembers his nobles. This is referencing again the king of Nineveh. They stumble in their walk. They make haste to her walls, and the defense is prepared. So we know this is now talking again about the defenders. Now, verse 6 is a very interesting verse. No, I'm sorry, verse 5. Verse 5. The Assyrian army in Nineveh prepares now their futile defense. The once dominant force now stumbles in confusion. And that's what God can do to you when he chooses to punish. Here's that same verse from the New Living Translation. The king shouts to his officers. They stumble in their haste, rushing to the walls to set up their defenses. Probably a pretty good translation. Verse 6, the gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. Now, I want to comment about that one. This is the one that I meant that is a very interesting verse. The New Living Translation says, the river gates have been torn open. The palace is about to collapse. And I take that, coupled with commentaries, as a little more accurate description. The gates of the rivers and the palace, as the King James says, is dissolved. Now, how could that be? Well, there is record, and again, you do find this outside of the Bible. What's most important is what we read in the Bible. But getting some outside information is helpful, and it actually, supports everything that we read in the Bible. There was a record flood of the Tigris, that is the Tigris River, recorded in some of the ancient annals. And that is what is likely prophesied here. There were a series of gates in which the Tigris water was also diverted into moats. And there were a stream or streams that also fed water into Nineveh. And as so many of the ancient cities had, they had these moats, which was added protection outside of their walls. And maybe some of you studied this, but it's quite fascinating. From Ellicott's commentary on the Bible, I'll read a quote from him, and he's quoting someone else. Diodorus, I think it is Siculus, who was an ancient historian, recorded that the walls were 100 feet high. Nineveh seemed almost impregnable. And I've read in other commentaries a somewhat lesser height of the walls, but this historian recorded them as 100 feet tall. It's recorded that, quote, 3 chariots could drive upon them abreast. 3 chariots side by side could drive on the top of these walls. Think of what this must have been like. Against ramparts such as these, the most elaborate force of ancient times may well have been comparatively powerless. And I take that as an accurate statement by this historian. How would horses, chariots, some of the battering rams and the military hardware they had at the time was not going to be very effective against 100-foot walls, with the defenders up above who could also sling stones and shoot arrows down at you. But now I want to go back and quote a little more from this commentary. On the other hand, the force of a swollen river has often proved suddenly fatal to the strongest modern masonry. It would be specially destructive where, as in the case of Nineveh, the walls inundated were of sun-dried brick or claybat. And I heard Mr. Darius McNeely comment about this in one of his studies, where the building blocks, if you will, massive blocks in these walls, were actually made out of a sun-dried or a baked clay, but it was never fired in a kiln like brick. So consequently, it has some structure and some strength, but not like real brick or concrete as we might envision. When that is subjected to a flood, flowing water, it begins to crumble. It begins to dissolve. And I'm not sure the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians had to do all that much, because there is record of a portion of this huge wall just collapsing. And when the water receded, they could walk right in. So again, these accounts collaborate exactly what God is saying through Nahum. Verse 7. Verse 7, it is decreed, she shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maidservants shall lead her as with the voice of doves beating their breasts. Again, some interesting language in this verse, and there is some obscure meaning here. If any of you have the original King James in front of you tonight, it will say an Huzzab, a proper name, Huzzab, or Huzzab, shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up. it is indicating, and this Hebrew word is somewhat obscure if you care to study that, but it indicates a lady of prominence, perhaps the queen, being led away captive. And her maids are just mourning like the cry of doves, and at the same time, they're beating their breasts. You know, that indicates anguish. They just can't deal with what's going on. The voice of doves. So many of us live in the, well, you wouldn't have to live in the country necessarily, even in town if it's quiet. You listen to mourning doves in the morning. I'm not good at imitating those sounds, but it is a mournful sound. And there's just so much meaning in every phrase here. So this great city is coming to this because God has decreed it. And it does indicate even the queen is going to be led away captive. Verse 8, though Nineveh of old was like a pool of water, now they flee away. Halt, halt, they cry, but no one turns back. So Nineveh was once a place that drew people. You know, in the physical sense, particularly in that region, that is a dry region. And of course, people are drawn to water. And Nineveh was right there on the Tigris River, in a very desirable location. But also, it was a melting pot of people. They brought in so many people from the conquered nations, those that they allowed to live. And people, sometimes, you know, large numbers of people are also compared to waters in the Bible. So again, this is quite interesting. I want to read a little further in my notes. That latter part of the verse, even though people were drawn to Nineveh of old when it was great, now they flee. Everyone wants to get out of there. And there are some who are crying out, you know, what are they saying? Well, halt, halt, stop, come back. Perhaps, you know, you got people trying to guard the treasure and so forth, the treasures. But they keep going. They're fleeing for their lives. It says no one turns back. So the time is going to come, and it happened when people would cry out to the people they hoped, you know, might guard them or take care of them, halt, halt, come back. But that cry falls on deaf ears. Verse 9. Take spoil of silver, take spoil of gold. There is no end of treasure or wealth of every desirable prize. So through Nahum, God is saying to those who are going to come up and destroy Nineveh, you go in, take what you want. You know, there's that old saying, what goes around comes around. Or from the Bible, you reap what you sow. The Assyrians went in and plundered nations. They carried away immense wealth back to their capital, which at this time is Nineveh, and it was just overflowing with these precious metals and a lot of other things, a lot of other desirable things, their treasures. Again, wealth of every desirable prize. But now God is saying, it's going to happen to you exactly as you did to others. They're going to come in and take it all away from you. Verse 10, she is empty, desolate, and waste. And that's what the Assyrians had done to so many other nations, made them desolate and empty. Remove the people. Now it's going to happen to them. Notice These once mighty people. Next part of verse 10, the heart melts and the knees shake. Much pain is in every side, and all their faces are drained of color. All their faces are drained of color. Now, some translations say their faces are turned black. I think it's easy enough to understand the heart melts. You just have no, fortitude or strength to stand up and do something. But their face is drained of color. There's something interesting about that if you study it a little bit in depth. From the pulpit commentary, it says, the Hebrew implies that the faces assume a livid hue like that of coming death. And if you've seen a person, which I've only seen 2 or 3 times, but a person who is dying, their faces do drain of color. And it happens very quickly. But these people are going to be in such fear. That's what they're going to look like. These once mighty, brave, bold people. When God steps in, that's what happens. Verses 11 and 12. Poetic language, verse 11. Where is the dwelling of the lions, and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion walked, the lioness and lion's cub, and no one made them afraid. The lion tore in pieces enough for his cubs, killed for his lionesses, filled his caves with prey and his dens with flesh. Quite poetic language, but remember, and I did cover this in the first part of chapter 1 study on Nahum, they were known to be lion hunters. Any of you remember that? And some of the... I'm not using any slides tonight, but they show that. And those have been discovered through archaeology in these carvings in sandstone. They're hunting and killing lions. And a lot of the ancient emperors compared themselves to lions in power. To this day, we sometimes refer to a lion as the king of the beasts. Well, again, poetically, the lion, the leader of the pride, which is a herd of lions, would reference the king. And they provided lavishly for their queens and for those in their inner courts, for their own sons and daughters, the cubs. They pillaged others and took from them, but they provided lavishly again. And I said queens, plural, because many of them had more than one wife. They were well taken care of and pampered. All kinds of supplies. They never had any want for anything. But that's all going to change. That's all going to change. Verse 13. This is the last verse of the chapter. Verse 13. Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall be heard no more. I'd like to read that verse also from another translation, or at least parts of it. This is the New Living Translation. I am your enemy, says the Lord of heaven's armies. Your chariots will soon go up in smoke. Your young men will be killed in battle. Never again will you plunder conquered nations. The voices of your proud messengers will be heard no more. The Bible records one of those messages and a messenger, and that's again in the account of the Assyrians coming against Jerusalem in Hezekiah's day. And remember, the messenger showed up with this letter. And of course, that struck fear in Hezekiah. I keep referencing that without turning there, assuming all of us know that story. Now, he reacted properly and took it before God, and he was delivered. But these messengers would show up with these threatening letters. Well, God said that will happen no more. As mighty as Nineveh, as the capital was, and by extension, as mighty as the Assyrian Empire was, when God says, I am against you, you're done for. There's no way to resist. I'd like to, as I begin to close, ask you to turn to Hebrews 10 with me, because this really has a bearing on what we've been studying. I'd like you to go to Hebrews chapter 10, please. I'll give you just a moment to get there. If you're there, I'd like to begin in verse 30. Hebrews 10, verse 30. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people. Now, this is written in a much later time, but there's a principle here I want us to get. And in verse 31, very important, verse 31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That verse sobers me every time I read it. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And that is exactly what had happened to Israel earlier. I read just snippets of that at the beginning of the study, but now that is what is happening and did happen as Nahum prophesied to Nineveh. And by extension to the whole empire, disappears, because it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. You know, God used Assyria to punish his people. And they would plunder, they would persecute them, but did he tell them to cut off limbs? Did he tell them to torture them? No. No. The Assyrians went way too far, and now they're not only going to suffer, they are literally going to be blotted out from the face of the earth back at that time. So, God's word is sure. You know, there are two things I'd like to leave you with as I conclude. Everything that Nahum prophesied as God's messenger happened. Nineveh and that empire absolutely ceased to exist. Only in history do we read about it. Go over to that part of the world today, they're gone, long gone. And were it not for archaeological excavations in the middle 1800s, we wouldn't even know where Nineveh was. So I leave you with that. Everything Nahum prophesied came to pass. That's a big lesson for us. What God says he will do will happen. And the second thing, I'm going to emphasize this once more. Remember duality. This will happen again in different times and places. But don't forget the lessons here. You and I have to be vigilant watchers of what is going on in the world today. And that leads into our discussion topics. I'm going to read those, first of all, for the sake of those who will hear this later via recording, and you can think about it. But here are the discussion topics that I put out earlier today. Nineveh, and by extension the nation of Assyria, are recorded to have controlled one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, and yet it was reduced to nothing. Now, we've talked about some of this, but what are some of the causes of such a collapse? I'd like to expand upon that and get your thoughts in discussion. The second topic, what lessons should we learn from that previous question? And then going a little further, is the nation that you and I live in going down part of the same path? That's a pretty sobering thing to think about. But looking around us today, you can apply it either to Israel, who God chose to punish through Assyria, or to Nineveh and Assyria themselves. Are we going down in part that same path? And then hence, there's some pretty sobering lessons here. With that, I thank you for everyone who is present tonight. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we'll go into discussion.